Is the market going to crash? This is by far the most frequently asked question I get. It is the most difficult question to answer. Probably the one question that I will rarely even try to answer. I want to kind of actually explain why that is. I haven't really done much content lately. I've been really immersed in the market. I'm just ramping back up with Adam DC, who's an awesome videographer that I've brought on board to work with. So really excited for some content that we're going to be putting out. But the economic side of things, sort of just a little passion project that I do on my own. And I just wanted to touch on that a little bit today. To answer the question succinctly, I don't think the market is going to crash in such that a crash is a massive, substantial drop in value. And I think that there are two important things that happened in the market since the beginning of the pandemic that make it so that the government can't afford to let that happen. So the first thing is that I think Royal LePage estimated something like 25% of millennials, so my generation and the generation of most of the people who consume my content, at least on Instagram and YouTube, 25% of us bought homes during the pandemic. It doesn't say whether or not those are first timers or second timers or whatever, but 25% purchased real estate. 1/4 of millennials purchased real estate since the beginning of the global pandemic. So the exposure to the new generation and what would be the second largest generation within the population pyramid of Canada, and this is important, millennials have been exposed to real estate now. So you've created a second generation of large-scale exposure to Canadian real estate and the credit economy that we have. So there's long-term credit cycle implications to that. And compounding that, the inflation that has happened in existing assets, namely residences already owned by boomers, millennials, and Gen X, have increased so much in value that the equity exposure has grown. And there have literally been explicit statements from the government that have basically said that they're going to do everything that they can to ensure that home values stay propped up. And I believe them. I think that, and I want to get to the why of that, other than the millennial exposure. But I think the first thing to examine here is that we've actually seen in the suburban GTA home values actually decline a little bit from like March to April highs. I would say February, March, April were really, really high. But this will come out in the fullness of time. But what I think is that the spring market actually happened early, and every year you see the same thing happen, save for the last 2 years, because the spring market was shuffled around by lockdown and different policy changes. And so the 2 years of data are difficult to use for year-over-year comparison and for really any type of extraction. And that's another reason why I haven't really been really granularly looking at the micro anymore. But every year in the spring market, typically bigger homes sell because it's families who are purchasing those homes to move in the summer. And so you'll often see prices go up, and that's why people think, oh, it's the best time of year to sell is in the spring because my house is going to be worth the most during that period of time. And that's not really the case. It's just that there's a selection bias because more bigger homes are transacting during that period of time, so the average price gets skewed up by the type of product. So it's a composition mix that creates a skew that creates a perception that homes are worth more in the spring market. And then in the summer, you start to see more investor product, maybe some of the stragglers from the spring market with faster closings, maybe some cottages, which, in a traditional year aren't insanely inflated. This year, I'm going to do a video just about those, but a lot of inflation in the cottage side of things. And so prices have already come down. So I'm going to say our spring market volume and price growth is behind us. We're in the summer market. I think that people are focused on, especially with Ontario economy opening up, people are focused on what they're going to do with their time. They're going to go enjoy the summer. The last thing that we're really focusing on is buying and selling real estate. So I do think that prices are going to settle a little bit. And I anticipated this January, February, saying I think that we're more likely to reach an equilibrium. And sometimes in the process of reaching an equilibrium, there are some ups and downs to get to what this new normal price is. Now we're at this new normal price. I don't anticipate we're going to see many more years of 30% growth. I think that we've proven to ourselves once in the past, in 2017, that was not sustainable. And the government has doubled down on their willingness to implement policy to slow this kind of unsustainable growth. In 2017, they implemented the non-resident speculation tax, or the NRST, which reduced the buying power of foreign investors by 15% across the board. This time they implemented an increase in the stress test. So the qualifying rate for, first it was uninsured mortgages, and that was in May, and then they increased the insured mortgages in June 1st. And these reduced the buying power of those two groups by like anywhere from like 1 to 7%. So pretty marginal, but it's a statement, I think. And I think that that policy response might actually be blamed for what we'll learn retroactively is price coming down a little bit. And it really depends on if the media grabs onto the negative housing story, if this becomes some sort of systemic change in sentiment, or a partisan shift in consumer psychology around real estate. I don't think that's going to happen. And the reason that I don't think that's going to happen is because I actually think that our current government, given all of the spending that they've done, this is completely independent of politics and party, but I think that with the amount of money that the central bank has pumped into the economy through bond purchases, the amount that the chartered banks, your big six banks, have levered up that cash from those purchases and put it out into the credit economy in Canada, our exposure to Canadian real estate as a country is so high that I think that the government essentially used housing to simplify the very arduous task of helping boomers retire in a private way. They put the onus of that, they socialized that challenge. And what I mean by this is that by inflating the value of boomers' houses, something like 79% of baby boomers own real estate in Canada, own their principal residence. So by inflating the values, it's the same reason that the government might be compelled to lie about CPI, about the inflation index, or consumer price index, because CPP, the Canadian Pension Program, and most public pensions are indexed at CPI, at inflation, which means that if they have to track it at real inflation, they have to have a higher return on those pensions to be able to afford to pay the pension system. And you have the biggest piece of the population pyramid in Canada, boomers, retiring within the next decade, many of whom advancing those retirement plans because of COVID and because of work from home, etc. So what's the easiest way to transfer a lot of wealth into their pockets to relieve the burden on the system that now has this new burden of paying for the global pandemic? The easiest way from my perspective is inflate their assets. And I think that the easiest way from the government's perspective is to inflate their assets. And so this is, from my perspective, our generation, maybe not millennials so much. I mean, obviously we're the ones buying and bidding up these values, but maybe the future generations who are actually being marginalized out of ownership as a result, they're pawning off the burden of, or a portion of the burden of retiring this entire generation onto the existing economy and the future working class through the housing asset. Not that there's anything wrong with that, because it probably would be pawned off, or not, maybe not pawned off, maybe that's the wrong word, but it would become the responsibility of that the same group through taxes anyways. This is a simpler way to accomplish that goal. It keeps the credit system in Canada healthy. It really screws the people who don't own assets in my generation and future generations. And it moves us closer and closer to what I would call a European housing model, which I've talked a lot about, but just one more time to recap is basically you look at Munich or most German cities, Frankfurt actually would be a better example, very low ownership, like 10% home ownership, everyone rents, especially young people rent. Outside of the cities is where most of the ownership is, so suburban areas, and it's multi-generational land ownership. If you owned a home, you typically inherited it from your parents. Maybe they're still paying a mortgage on it. And I actually think that might be a healthy thing, given the way, and not to get too metaphysical about it, but the way that Canadians interpret and our relationship with housing as a status, a commodity, an investment. If you look at Europe, their peace and their minimalism and the way that they see a house as a home and not the other things that I just mentioned is healthy, and it allows them to focus on other things in their life rather than the housing rat race. And I just posted a picture of these two things that, like, this is all that we talk about in Canada is real estate. And I think that we got to get away from that, and this might actually be the most efficient way to do it, is to make it like, okay, yeah, it's just a place that I live and that's it, and let's move on. And I think that we're stuck here. I do think my big fear that remains, and I've kind of like capitulated on my bearishness, but I think that my big fear that remains is that this is creating a massive credit cycle that, if we don't see wage inflation and economic growth, actual growth and diversification of the Canadian economy, all of this money that's being spent today has to be paid back eventually. If you go watch Ray Dalio's How the Economic Machine Works video on YouTube, highly recommended. And think about that, and then think about the country that is now leading the world in debt to GDP ratio, in debt per capita ratio, in debt to household income ratio. It doesn't create an awesome model for us to not, or to grow in because we still have to pay that money back first before we can do that.